Three babies were born on the same night in Henrico County, Virginia, and by dawn one of them had been erased. What happened in that room on an April night in 1802 didn't stay private for long. It hid behind ledgers, private letters, and hushed talk among the enslaved women. Tonight we pull those scraps together to show how one choice, made in fear, shattered lives for generations. On a spring evening along the James River, the tobacco plantations uncooped the season into rows of dark soil and hum of work. Fairmont was a large place, nearly 800 acres of river-bottom land and 43 people whose labor had built the family's fortune across 3 generations. The house sat on a rise, 2 stories of brick and white columns visible from the river road, an announcement of prosperity that few of the people who toiled there could share. Margaret Fairmont arrived at that house 6 years earlier as a young bride from a smaller family estate in Williamsburg. She was the youngest Sutherland daughter, a line that prided itself on descent from English gentry, an inheritance Margaret's mother never failed to remind her of. Her marriage to Thomas Fairmont was celebrated as a tidy alliance. Old money, steady land, a handsome match that reassured neighbors and relatives alike. Thomas carried responsibility the way the plantation expected, serious, methodical, and often absent. By 1802, however, the polished façade showed hairline cracks. Margaret had lost 2 pregnancies early in the marriage. The first was mourned quietly. The second left her withdrawn through an entire winter. Thomas, increasingly busy with business and politics, drifted farther into the work of managing fields and accounts. The pressure for an heir weighed heaviest on Margaret, prodded daily by her mother's letters that tracked every cousin's child, as if family worth were measured in offspring. When Margaret conceived again in 1801, the household seemed to breathe. Thomas relaxed into attention. Margaret's mother arrived to declare the pregnancy blessed. The house servants set up a nursery with an unusual tenderness, perhaps sensing that this child meant something more than a single birth. What nobody expected was that Margaret was carrying 3. It was Dr. Edmund Yancey, the county physician for wealthier families, who first suspected multiples in February when he felt repeated and unusual movement. A later check confirmed it. Twins, maybe triplets. Margaret swung between joy and dread. Thomas, pragmatic as ever, began casually counting heirs like business gains. Margaret, however, harbored a fear she'd never voiced, that one of her children might reveal a secret that would undo everything. A woman named Esther worked in the Fairmont house who knew more of its rhythms than anyone. Born on the plantation 28 years earlier, Esther was trusted with delicate duties and moved through rooms with quiet competence. She'd lost 2 infants herself, tragedies recorded in the ledger as a decrease and then forgotten. During the pregnancy, Margaret leaned on Esther in a way she hadn't before, insisting Esther attend her mornings, stay when the doctor came, even sleep in the tiny servant room off the master bedroom in case of need. Thomas noticed and said nothing. A pregnant woman's whims were small things to indulge. That summer of 1801 had been different. Thomas took a 3-week trip to Williamsburg to handle family business. Margaret remained at Fairmont on doctor's advice, walking the grounds in early mornings and spending long hours on the back veranda where she could watch the workers in the fields. Among those workers was William, a light-skinned carpenter purchased 3 years earlier whose sale documents noted his unusual coloring. In Thomas's absence, Margaret and William's paths crossed more than they would have. What happened in those quiet days wasn't recorded in letters or receipts. It was the kind of thing plantation records never captured. 9 months later, as labor began on April 23, 1802, Margaret understood there was a chance the infants might look different in a way she could not bear. The labor began at dinner. Her water broke and the household moved into a practiced chaos. Dr. Yancey lived 8 miles away. Esther summoned the experienced midwife Ruth and set about managing the room. Thomas paced downstairs, brandy in hand, as a man in his position ought to. In Margaret's chamber the fear turned raw. She gripped Esther's hand until her knuckles paled and, between contractions, whispered frantic pleas that Ruth couldn't parse, but Esther understood. The first baby arrived near midnight, a sturdy boy, loud and bright. He was wrapped and placed in the cradle. An hour later the second came, another vigorous boy, smaller but healthy. Thomas was quiet, then pleased, then bewildered by the sudden abundance. Dr. Yancey arrived as the second child came. He examined Margaret and warned there might be more. At 2:17 a.m., the third child was born. For a breathless, strange moment the room held its own kind of hush. This infant was not as pale as his brothers. His skin carried a golden brown that set him apart in a way that mattered terribly in that place and time. He was smaller only in complexion. He cried and drew breath with clear life. Margaret made a sound between a sob and a whimper. Esther, who'd been at her side through all the turns of the pregnancy, moved with sudden certainty and took the child into her arms. "Miss Margaret needs rest," Esther said, voice flat and commanding in a way that made even Dr. Yancey look up. "Fetch fresh linens. Prepare a tonic." While Ruth and the doctor busied themselves, Esther and Margaret exchanged a look that contained everything unsaid. A promise, a pact. Esther spoke next, loud enough for the doctor to hear. "The third is weak, may not survive the night." Dr. Yancey glanced. The baby's cry was muffled against Esther's body but present. He muttered that weaker triplets weren't uncommon and left a suggestion to fate. Thomas was not summoned. Instead, the doctor reported that while two sons were well, the third had been born feeble and was unlikely to make it until morning. For him, 2 heirs would do. Triplets complicated things. Sometime before dawn, with instructions left for Margaret, Dr. Yancey departed. The house quieted. Thomas, relieved and a little drunk on the relief and brandy, slept in his study. Ruth returned to the service quarters. Esther remained, the third infant hidden at her chest. "What will you do?" Margaret asked in a whisper that no one else heard. "What you ask," Esther said. "Hide him. No one can know." Margaret's eyes pleaded. Esther looked at the sleeping child, warm, breathing, small, and made a decision that would haunt the place for decades. Esther knew the plantation's map and its shadows the way others know their kin. She padded through the black fields toward the old dairy, a small stone building long since superseded by a newer structure. Inside the dairy the air was cool and damp. Mice rustled in the walls. She wrapped the infant tighter and waited, thinking of the choices women made in impossible situations. Infants died frequently on plantations. A missing body could be chalked up to natural loss. She could do what some whispered women had done before: smother the child, bury another tiny coffin, let the ledger count as final. But Esther's hands wouldn't do that. Instead, she crossed deeper into the quarters where the enslaved families lived in cramped cabins. There, at the far edge, lived an older woman everyone called Dinah. Dinah was in her 50s, worn by years of field labor, but still sharp-eyed. She had outlived children and husbands, and her place in the community was strange and steady. Too old for hard fieldwork, too useful to be dismissed. Esther knocked and Dinah opened as if she had expected her. "You have something for hiding?" Dinah asked without surprise. Esther revealed the bundle. Dinah's face didn't flinch. "Different how?" she asked. "Darker," Esther said. "Miss Margaret says he's weak, says he won't be kept." Dinah took the child from her without ceremony. He settled against her chest as if he had always been there. "What's his name?" she asked. "Samuel," Esther replied. A name said softly, the first identity given to a child otherwise condemned to anonymity. Dinah agreed to raise him in secret, to keep him sheltered and fed, to tell any curious neighbor that the baby had been returned from another plantation as some mercy for a dead mother. The arrangement was dangerous but plausible. Thomas rarely inspected the quarters closely. People came and went, and the household's attention focused on the fields and ledgers more than on lives in the shadows. Esther walked back to the house as dawn bled into the sky and told Margaret the child had been taken. Margaret closed her eyes and let relief pour through her. She believed the problem solved. Downstairs, the story was made official. The third son had died in the night. A small coffin was prepared and buried with the proper ritual. The traveling minister said a prayer. Only Esther and Dinah knew the box held stones. Life resumed its surface rhythms. Margaret named her two acknowledged sons Thomas Jr. and Henry. Portraits were commissioned. The nursery bustled. But out at the edge of the quarters, Samuel, given a name and a secret life, learned to reach and smile inside a different kind of household, one made of thrifted tenderness and quiet vigilance. Dinah kept him indoors by day, showed him at times only when it was safe, and told a simple story. The child had been sent from another plantation after his mother died. It worked because, for Thomas, the quarters were invisible unless something broke his routine. Esther visited often, bringing cloth and small comforts. She watched the child as his skin warmed with sun and age, the hint of mixed ancestry growing clearer. Around the cabins, people began to notice. Dinah's rations seemed a touch richer. Esther's visits were regular and protective, and when Samuel ran with a toy, a few faces traced the same jawline in the boys who grew under Margaret's careful eye. Knowledge spread in whispers, not in ledgers or court records, but in the way people watched one another on a plantation where survival depended on knowing more than the master ever did. Some among the enslaved saw opportunity in that knowledge. One of them was Jacob, an overseer in the fields who had a complicated standing, enslaved himself, but given authority over others. He watched, calculated, and waited. In the spring of 1804, when Samuel was 2 and the resemblance to the Fairmont boys was impossible to ignore, Jacob took his chance. "Master Fairmont," Jacob said one morning while the young planter walked between rows of new tobacco, "there's something you ought to know about, sir, about the family." Thomas straightened. "Explain." Jacob led him to Dinah's cabin at mid-morning, a time when most were at work, and the old woman was allowed to sit outside. There, on the dirt beside her, was Samuel, playing with a carved wooden toy. Thomas stopped several paces away and stared. The house had thought it buried what the quarters had never forgotten. The look Thomas fixed on that child, a look that mixed disbelief, anger, and a dawning calculation, is what we'll pick up next. When he takes those steps forward, a quiet conspiracy will meet a man whose world depends on things staying exactly as he believes them to be. The little boy glanced up and locked eyes with the man who'd raised 2 pale boys as his own. The tilt of the head, the slope of the cheek, the way the child held himself, it all echoed a face Thomas knew by heart. He saw himself in that child. He saw his sons and his father reflected back in a small, sun-dark face. The resemblance wasn't a hint. It was a fact that hit him like a physical blow. "Where did this child come from?" Thomas asked, voice barely steady. Dinina rose with the creak of old bones and replied calmly, "My grandson, sir. My daughter's boy from North Carolina." She told the tale matter-of-factly. The daughter sold long ago, sent away in 1796, reported dead the next year. Thomas listened, but the story didn't land. The dates pressed into his mind. Born in the spring of 1802, the same year Margaret's labor, had produced 3 sons. The math by itself was a quiet accusation. "How old is he?" Thomas demanded. "Near 2, sir," Dinina answered. Something inside Thomas snapped. He left the yard in a rush, his walk turning into a run until he burst into the morning room where Margaret sat, needle in hand, twins playing at her feet. His control was paper-thin. "Take the children out, now," he ordered, voice cold enough to stop the nursery maid in her tracks. The boys were hauled away, faces puzzled. "Tell me about the third child," Thomas demanded as he stalked toward his wife. Margaret's face drained of color. "What do you mean?" "The one you said died." He didn't give her a chance. "I saw him in the quarters. A 2-year-old who looks like me." She crumbled into a chair. The confession came out in jagged pieces. A lonely summer when Thomas had been away, the comfort of William the carpenter, a closeness that grew in those empty hours, and then the pregnancy that might have been Thomas's or might have been William's. The delivery of 3 boys, and Margaret's terror when one looked different. I was frightened, she sobbed. I thought if anyone knew, it would ruin me. My family would disown me. You would cast me out. I gave the child away. Thomas's voice went ice cold. You gave away my son. In the plantation's cruel arithmetic, it didn't matter which man sired the child. A child born under the roof belonged to the man who owned that roof. Whatever else he is mine. That idea, ownership as identity, was a doctrine Thomas could not set aside. Esther was summoned. She came with a slow, measured step, eyes steady as a woman who knew the cost of candor. Thomas confronted her. She had taken the infant and hidden him instead of doing what had to be done to erase the evidence. Esther met his stare without flinching. Miss Margaret told me to hide him, she said. She told me to make him go away. You were supposed to dispose of him, Thomas shot back, the words like a whip. Not carry him into the quarters. I did what was asked, Esther replied. I hid him. There was a hard edge in her voice that made Thomas flush with a kind of impotent fury. He considered punishment the lash that maintained order and taught obedience. But beneath his anger sat a new problem. Esther had knowledge, and knowledge in the wrong hands threatened everything he valued. You've put me in a bind, he said finally. That child cannot stay where he is. He will be suspicion, scandal, a living question. Esther's answer was sharp and practical. Then sell him, she said. Sell him like you sell any other inconvenient thing. Thomas turned the words over. Selling a 2-year-old meant questions, rumors, a bargaining that might reveal parentage he could not afford to have aired. He weighed his options and settled on a compromise that inverted the plantation's usual power dynamic. He would keep the secret, and the 4 who knew, himself, Margaret, Esther, and Dinina, would hold it tightly. Dinina would continue to care for the boy as her grandson. He would not be seen in the house, and if any whisper escaped, Esther would answer for it. Do you understand? He warned. Esther met his gaze and nodded. She knew the code. He could have whipped her for insubordination. Instead, the threat of exposure kept them all restrained. Dinina was brought to the study and given strict terms. The child remained with her, but he was to be kept away from the house, away from visitors, and invisible to society. Extra rations were promised as compensation, small mercies in a world built on denial. For a while the arrangement seemed to hold. Margaret sank into a private illness, shame wrapped tight around her body. Thomas hid himself in work, traveling, and tending the plantation accounts with a new, brittle preoccupation. Outside the house, in the quarters, Samuel, as Esther had named him, learned the rhythms of a double life. Dinina sheltered him by day, brought him out only at safe hours, and spun a plausible tale about a child sent from another estate. Esther checked in, bearing cloth and food. The servants kept a careful silence. Secrecy on a plantation, however, is porous. The first crack came from visitors. It was expected that neighbors and kin would come to view the household and its heirs. With display came danger. One autumn morning in 1805, Charlotte, Margaret's older sister, walked through the rows of cabins with the patronizing curiosity of a well-born woman. At the far end she found Samuel playing with a carved toy. He looked up with the uninhibited confidence of a child, and Charlotte stopped dead. She saw the family likeness instantly. Whose child is that? She demanded. Dinina stepped forward, placing herself between Charlotte and Samuel. My grandson, ma'am, she said. Charlotte's skepticism was immediate. She walked straight to her sister and accused her with the merciless efficiency of kin who read advantage in scandal. There's a child in the quarters the same age as your twins, she said. You'll explain this to me. Margaret refused to meet her gaze. She clung to parts of the story that still protected her, but Charlotte's accusations forced the truth into the open in enough detail to be dangerous. Charlotte's solution was brutal and neat. Make the child disappear properly. An accident, an illness, something plausible that could be passed off as the common misfortunes that plagued infant lives on plantations. No, Margaret cried. Her maternal instinct, long frayed, rose up. Charlotte was unrelenting. You don't have a choice unless you want to destroy the family. When Thomas returned and was confronted by the sisters' unified push, his practical side, the part that tallied risk and reputation, thought like a man who kept ledgers. He wavered, told them the child would stay for now until a more tolerable solution could be arranged. Charlotte left, having ceded the idea and confident that Thomas's prudence would eventually bend to convenience. But seeds spread. Charlotte mentioned the scandal to her husband in confidence. He, loosened by drink and club conversation, named it to an acquaintance, and gossip began to leak. By spring 1806, fragments of the affair had reached neighboring plantations. Rumors multiplied and mutated. Some said Thomas himself had sired a child with an enslaved woman. Others blamed Margaret's infidelity. Others dismissed everything as jealous lies. The net effect was the same. The Fairmont name cooled in society circles. Invitations thinned. Business courtesies turned distant. Thomas felt the chill of a reputation losing its polish and, in June, made a decision. He summoned Dinina and ordered that Samuel be prepared for a journey to Richmond, to be placed in service in a household there. He framed it as a mercy. The child would be well taken care of, but he could not remain. Dinina accepted with a stillness born of having endured too many cruelties to show panic. The plan was set. 3 days. That night Dinina made a quiet, desperate choice. She packed what little she could and went to Esther. They whispered through plans that were part hope and part fantasy, routes to freedom, sympathetic families who might hide them, places where dogs and patrols were thin. The networks were fragile and dangerous, but they existed. Better to try and fail than hand Samuel away to strangers. So, before dawn, Dinina took Samuel and slipped into the dark woods instead of toward the road. For a while they moved, Dinina steadying the boy when his small feet stumbled, telling him stories about new places. But distance is measured in time and energy, and her old joints betrayed her. Samuel misstepped and twisted an ankle. They were slowed. By the time light diluted the forest, they had only crawled a few miles, not far enough. Dogs and men were already hunting. Dinina hid under a tangle of branches and wrapped Samuel in a blanket. For a moment, Samuel slept, exhausted by fear and the night's exertion. But trained hounds pick up scent, and men follow orders. The search party closed in. 6 horsemen, 2 rifles, leashes straining as the dogs sounded their fines. Dinina knew capture was likely. She held Samuel close, whispering words that meant everything and nothing to a 4-year-old. When the men surrounded them, she stepped forward slowly, trying to protect him. But tenacity and love could not match weapons and numbers. One man seized Samuel from her arms. She reached but was pulled aside. They bound her hands behind her back with rough rope and marched her back to the plantation. The child snatched away, and the hunters carrying with them the echo of Dinina's defiant whisper, "Be brave." Mounted men ringed the grove, hounds straining at their leashes. One of the riders lifted Samuel into his arms as the child cried for Dinina, reaching with the instinct only a small child knows. The trek back to Fairmont felt endless for Dinina. Her feet bled, her breath came short, and her old body was pushed to the edge of collapse. Still she walked with her chin raised, refusing to let them see the shame she'd accepted in order to save a boy. Thomas waited on the front steps. He took Samuel from the rider, inspecting him as if to confirm the child's body was intact, then watched the child go suddenly still, too exhausted and terrified to wail any longer. Without hesitation he issued the sentence. "Take her to the barn," he said, pointing at Dinina. 20 lashes. Then into the cellar for 3 days. No food. Water only. Dinina had known capture was possible, but the reality struck like a blow. At her age, 20 lashes might finish her. The overseer hesitated. "Sir," he murmured, She might not see that she lives long enough to understand. Thomas snapped. Let her survive this so she remembers the price of defiance. They dragged Dinina toward the barn. Samuel, seeing the old woman led away, began to scream again, wrenching against Thomas's arms. Grandma, don't hurt Grandma, he cried, fingers clawing for the one steady presence he'd known. Esther appeared in the doorway, drawn by the noise. She watched the old woman hauled off, saw Samuel trembling in Thomas's grip, and understood in a single look that the situation had turned catastrophic. Quietly, without begging or defiance, she stepped forward. Master Fairmont, she said, voice even, let me hold the child. He's frightened. Thomas looked at her, the woman who'd first chosen to hide mercy in a world that demanded obedience. You knew something about this, didn't you? He asked, the accusation raw beneath his words. Esther met him squarely. I gave information, sir. I never expected she'd run. The tension hummed between them. Thomas could punish her as well, make an example of everyone involved. He was exhausted by the spiraling consequences. In the end, he made a pragmatic choice rather than a purely punitive one. All right, he said. Take him. Keep him in the quarters. We'll sort out punishment tomorrow. Esther gathered Samuel to her chest. He clung to her, small body shaking. She moved him away from the barn's sounds, shielding his ears, trying to offer whatever comfort a heavy-handed world allowed. They lashed Dinina in the barn with the cold efficiency of someone following routine. 20 blows fell. She screamed at first, then fell quiet, conserving whatever strength she had. When the lashings ended, they left her on the barn floor, wounds bleeding and raw. She survived, barely, but she would carry the damage with her for as long as she lived. The woman who'd risked everything to save a child spent the remainder of her days a little less present. Her spirit narrowed to the memory of that single, impossible act. The escape attempt changed everything. Samuel's visibility had blown apart the fragile bargain Thomas had tried to make. The child could no longer safely live quieted in the quarters. Yet at the same time the scandal had spread too widely for a simple solution. Selling the boy to a family in Richmond risked questions about why he was being transferred, why a child with such a likeness to the Fairmont twins was being disposed of. Any buyer might raise the very rumors Thomas had hoped to smother. Weeks of fruitless scheming followed. Thomas drank deeper, avoided his wife and the boy, and turned the problem over and over in his mind. Then a letter arrived from Charlotte. She'd been making discreet inquiries in Richmond and had found a missionary family bound for the western frontier, a couple who took children with them to raise in a mission school and move them far beyond the reach of chatter and curiosity. They asked no questions, Charlotte wrote. They wanted children in need to be trained and pious. Send the child west, she suggested, and call it charity. Thomas stared at the page. Ohio lay nearly 1,000 miles away, mountains, unsettled territory, far enough that Samuel would likely never surface near Fairmont again. The distance made the solution feel absolute. It wasn't murder. It was a permanent vanishing that could be dressed in benevolence. He accepted. In early September, Reverend Marcus Hayes and his wife Elizabeth arrived at Fairmont, plain, earnest, and ready to take children with them on their missionary trek. Thomas presented the boy as Dinina's grandson, a child who had lost his mother and would benefit from Christian instruction on the frontier. The Hayeses listened, sincere in their charity. Elizabeth insisted Samuel keep his name. Thomas felt a flicker of guilt at her kindness and tamped it down. This was the only workable resolution, he told himself. Samuel would have a chance the plantation couldn't give him. On the day they left, Esther handed Samuel over with a quiet, terrible grief. Learn everything, she told him. Remember who you are. Don't let anyone tell you you're less. Samuel, bewildered and too small to understand the orchestration of adult decisions, nodded and climbed into the wagon among goods and other children. Margaret watched from a window, hand pressed to the glass, feeling neither relief nor peace, but a hollow grief for a child she had never let herself claim. The wagon rolled away toward Richmond and then west, and the shape of Samuel receded into trees until he was gone. Dinina never recovered her spirit. She lived only a short time after the whipping, retreating into silence and a private world of memory and pain. Esther remained in the house, moving through the routines of service with a steadier hand than before. But she did something else as well. She began to write. In secret, she kept a journal, a personal chronicle of what had happened the night the triplets were born, and of the conspiracy that followed. She hid the notebook beneath a loose floorboard in her cabin, a small assurance that the truth would not vanish entirely. Time moved, and the Fairmont household decayed under the weight of what had been done. Margaret grew thin with remorse and illness and died in her early 40s, her passing scarcely remarked beyond family circles. Thomas, clutching to a sense of propriety and the stubborn idea of ownership, sank into work and poor investments. The sons who'd been raised as heirs left for education and life elsewhere. The plantation itself dwindled, parcels sold, debts mounting, until what had once been nearly 800 acres was a pale echo of its former prosperity. Esther was freed years later, under the terms of her relatives rather than through any noble gesture by Thomas. She moved to Richmond, worked as a seamstress, and carried her hidden journal with her. She never forgot the boy she had cradled. When she died, the journal passed down with her belongings. In 1889, a trunk was opened and the manuscript surfaced. The family, not sure what to do with a document that could stain reputations, donated it to the Historical Society with a caveat: keep it sealed for 50 years. Half a century after that, a graduate student digging into plantation life discovered Esther's words and recognized their significance. The house of memory cracked open, and historians finally began to ask, what became of the boy who left Fairmont for the frontier? The paper trail grows thin at that point. Mission records from the Ohio missions are sparse and fragmentary. There is one tantalizing trace in the 1850 census. A man named Samuel Hayes, listed as a schoolteacher in a small Ohio town, age about what you'd expect if he'd been born in 1802. The surname and profession fit a hopeful pattern, but there's no definitive proof that this Samuel is the child from Fairmont. He might be, he might not. The frontier was full of orphans and adopted names. Yet the mere possibility offers a different ending than the one planned at Fairmont. A life lived free of the plantation's shadow, a person who might have built identity and meaning far from the ledger books that once tried to deny him existence. Whether Samuel survived or perished on the frontier may never be known with certainty. That's the cruel truth of histories deliberately erased. But the larger question the tale raises is not limited to one child. How many other small lives were quietly excised from family trees, hidden under floorboards or buried with stones? How many mothers, fathers, and caretakers made impossible choices driven by fear and the grotesque logic of ownership and honor? This story matters because it is painfully human. It's not Gothic horror or mythology. It is choices made by real people within a brutal system. A mother protected two of her children at the exclusion of a third. A father treated lineage as property and called it protection. An older woman risked everything to save a small life and paid for it with pain. A servant kept a record in the hope that someday someone would ask, "What do you think happened to Samuel?" Do you believe the possible Samuel Hayes in Ohio is the same boy, or did his trail end on the frontier? Are there other secrets like this waiting in county archives and attics? Leave your thoughts below. I read every comment. If this story unsettled you, share it with someone who loves true mysteries. And if you want more uncovered histories like this, subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. The past is full of things we weren't meant to find, but when we do, they demand to be heard.